found out I was actually adopted at my mother's funeral. I, 32, arrived at my mother's funeral with a heavy heart, knowing that I had just lost the woman who had raised me and cared for me my entire life. I stood at the back of the church, surrounded by friends and family who had come to pay their respects, feeling a mix of grief and disbelief. Little did I know the worst was yet to come. As the service began, memories of my mother flooded my mind. I remembered her laughter, her warmth, and her unwavering love. I thought about the countless hours she had spent with me, teaching me right from wrong, guiding me through life's challenges, and always being there for me no matter what. And now she was gone. As the priest spoke words of comfort and hope, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see my aunt, my mother's sister, looking at me with tears in her eyes. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, leading me out of the church and into a quiet corner. "What is it, Aunt Marie?" I asked, trying to compose myself. She took a deep breath and looked at me with a mixture of sadness and hesitation. "I think it's time you knew the truth," she said softly. "You were adopted." It felt like the world had come crashing down around me. Adopted? How could that be possible? I had always believed that my mother was my biological mother, that we shared a bond that was unbreakable. And now, in the midst of her funeral, I was being told that it was all a lie. As my mind raced with questions and confusion, my aunt explained how my parents had struggled with infertility for years before deciding to adopt me. They had kept it a secret, wanting me to grow up feeling loved and wanted, without the burden of knowing the truth. And now, on the day of my mother's funeral, the truth had finally come out. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over me, anger at my parents for keeping such a huge secret from me, sadness at the loss of the identity I had always known, confusion about who I really was and where I truly belonged, and a deep sense of betrayal that threatened to consume me. But there was no time to process these emotions, as the funeral continued, and I was forced to put on a brave face for the rest of the attendees. I sat through the service in a daze, barely hearing the words being spoken, my mind consumed with the revelation that had turned my world upside down. As the funeral came to an end and people began to file out of the church, I felt a hand on my arm. It was my father, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, son," he choked out, his voice breaking with emotion. "I should have told you sooner. I hope you can forgive us." Looked into his eyes and saw the pain and regret etched in his face. In that moment, I realized that my parents had kept the truth from me not out of malice, but out of love. They had wanted to protect me, to shield me from the pain of knowing that I was not their biological child. And now, in their grief and guilt, they were asking for my forgiveness. Forgiveness was not something that came easily in that moment. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, like everything I had ever known about myself was a lie. How could I forgive my parents for keeping such a monumental secret from me? How could I come to terms with the fact that the identity I had always known was now shattered into a million pieces? As I left the church, my mind whirled with thoughts and emotions. I did not know where to turn or who to talk to. I was lost in a sea of uncertainty, trying to make sense of a reality that seemed so far removed from the life I had always believed I was living. One thing was clear. My world would never be the same again. The revelation of my adoption had opened a Pandora's box of emotions and questions that would haunt me for the rest of my days. And as I stood on the threshold of a new chapter in my life, I could only wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. As I drove home from the funeral, the weight of the truth I had just learned bore down on me like a heavy burden. I no longer knew who I was or where I came from. I was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no anchor to hold on to. My mind raced with questions and doubts. Why had my parents kept the truth from me for so long? What other secrets were they hiding? And most importantly, did this revelation change how they felt about me? Did they still love me, even though I was not their biological child? Days that followed were a blur of emotions and confusion. I struggled to come to terms with the truth of my adoption, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I looked in the mirror and saw a face that no longer felt familiar. I thought about my childhood, my upbringing, and the countless memories I had shared with my parents, and I wondered if any of it had been real. As I grappled with the fallout of the revelation, I found myself growing distant from my parents. The easy familiarity that had once defined our relationship was now tinged with a sense of awkwardness and unease. I felt like an outsider in my own family, unsure of where I belonged or who I truly was. And then, just when I thought things could not get any worse, another bombshell dropped. One day, as I was going through my mother's belongings, I found a letter tucked away in a drawer. It was addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Trembling with anticipation, I opened the letter and began to read. In it, my mother poured out her heart, confessing the pain and guilt she had felt about keeping the truth of my adoption from me. She apologized for the deception, for the hurt it had caused me, and for the years of lies that had defined our relationship. As I read her words, tears streamed down my face. I saw my mother in a new light, as a woman burdened by the weight of her secret, struggling to do what she thought was best for me. And in that moment I realized that despite the deception, despite the betrayal, my mother had loved me with all her heart. But her words also raised new questions and uncertainties. If my mother had felt such guilt about keeping the truth from me, why had she never told me herself? Why had she chosen to wait until her death to reveal the secret that had haunted her for so long? And most importantly, what did this revelation mean for my relationship with my parents going forward? As I grappled with these questions, I felt a growing sense of anger and resentment towards my parents. How could they have kept such a monumental secret from me for so long? How could they have robbed me of the chance to know my true identity and heritage? And how could they expect me to forgive them for the years of deception and lies? Amidst the anger and resentment, there was also a sense of sadness and loss. I mourned the childhood I thought I had, the family I thought I belonged to, and the mother I thought I knew. And as I stood at the crossroads of my past and my future, I knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and uncertainties unlike any I had ever faced before. In the weeks that followed my mother's funeral, tensions between me and my parents continued to simmer beneath the surface. The revelation of my adoption had opened up old wounds and created new rifts that seemed impossible to bridge. I struggled to come to terms with the truth of my past, while my parents grappled with the guilt and regret of their deception. It's the turmoil and uncertainty. One question burned in my mind. Am I the asshole? Was I wrong to feel anger and resentment towards my parents for keeping the truth from me? Was I justified in my sense of betrayal and hurt? Or was I simply overreacting, unable to see past my own pain to the love and intention that had motivated their actions? As I stood on the precipice of a new reality, I knew that the answers to these questions were not easy to come by. And as I faced the uncertainty of the road ahead, I could only hope that one day I would find the peace and understanding I so desperately sought. With that, I stepped into the unknown, unsure of what the future held, but determined to find my place in a world that was suddenly so unfamiliar and uncertain. Conclusion. The end, the revelation of my adoption at my mother's funeral, had left me and my parents on opposite sides of a vast divide. The truth had shattered the illusion of the perfect family I had believed in, leaving behind a tangled web of emotions and questions that seemed impossible to unravel. As I grappled with the fallout of the revelation, I found myself torn between conflicting feelings of anger, hurt, and love. I resented my parents for keeping such a monumental secret from me, for robbing me of the chance to know my true identity. But at the same time, I realized that their actions had come from a place of love and protectiveness, however misguided. As I looked towards the future, uncertain of where the road ahead would lead, I knew that forgiveness would not come easily. The wounds left by the revelation of my adoption ran deep, and the scars would take time to heal. But amidst the pain and confusion, I also held onto a sliver of hope that one day, I would find a way to move past the betrayal and rebuild the fractured relationship with my parents. The end, the revelation of my adoption at my mother's funeral had left both sides hating each other, their once unbreakable bond now tainted by the weight of a long-held secret. And as I navigated the rocky terrain of my new reality, I realized that the journey towards forgiveness and healing would be a long and arduous one. But I was determined to walk that path, no matter how difficult, in the hopes of finding peace and reconciliation in the end. Was this person in the wrong? Comment down below and make sure to like and subscribe.